"If you dance this waltz, you'll marry my son." Millionaire mocked, but the Black Maid turned out to be a dance champion. More stories like this, subscribe Story Tier. The grand ballroom was alive with golden light as chandeliers shimmered. Above, and the wealthy elite gathered in polished gowns and sharp tuxedos. A string quartet played softly, filling the air with an elegant rhythm as laughter and conversation echoed across the marble floors. The millionaire's wife stood at the center of it all, her pride as tall as the mansion's ceilings, her eyes scanning the room for any chance to showcase her superiority. That was when her gaze fell on the young Black Maid quietly serving, drinks moving humbly through the crowd with her tray. A sly smirk spread across her face as she raised her voice, ensuring every guest could hear her. "If you dance this waltz," she sneered, "you'll marry my son." The remark wasn't an invitation, it was mockery. The guests erupted in laughter, clinking glasses and whispering cruelly about the absurdity of a maid being anywhere near their aristocratic world. The young maid lowered her eyes, feeling the sting of ridicule, but deep within her heart, something else stirred, something stronger than shame. She placed the tray gently on a nearby table and stepped into the open space of the ballroom. The chatter slowly dimmed as curious eyes turned toward her. Whispers rippled through the room, some mocking, some intrigued, all waiting for her downfall. But the son, standing silently beside his father, noticed something the others did not. In her gaze, he saw no fear, only a spark of determination, a hidden fire waiting to break free. Unknown to them all, this maid was no stranger to the dance floor. Before life had humbled her into service, she had been a rising star in the world of ballroom dance, a young woman who carried trophies and titles, a champion who once commanded stages across the country. Years of discipline, years of artistry lived quietly within her, ready to surface at this very moment. The music swelled again, and as the first notes of the waltz filled the hall, she began to move. Her steps were graceful yet firm, each turn precise, her body gliding with a confidence that silenced every sneer. The laughter that once filled the room faded into stunned silence. She spun effortlessly, her skirt flowing like waves, her posture regal as though she were born for the ballroom. Gasps spread across the hall, and heads turned in disbelief. This was no servant fumbling for approval. This was a dancer reclaiming her crown. The son's eyes followed her every movement, admiration growing with each step, while his mother's smirk faltered into pale disbelief. By the time the music reached its crescendo, the maid's performance had transformed the atmosphere. The crowd that once mocked now stood frozen, some even moved to tears by the unexpected beauty before them. When the final note faded, the ballroom erupted into thunderous applause, shattering the silence that had held them captive. The millionaire's son stepped forward, his hand outstretched not as a token of pity, but of honor. His voice was steady, filled with respect. "You are no maid to mock," he declared. "You are a champion." That night, power and prejudice crumbled, and the world witnessed how grace, strength, and hidden greatness could silence arrogance in the most unforgettable way. At first, the maid lowered her gaze, clutching the tray tightly against her chest, as the words of mockery echoed in her ears. The cruel laughter of the guests rang louder than the violins, and each smirk thrown her way stung like a blade. For a moment, she wanted to disappear into the shadows of the grand hall, to continue being unseen and unheard, but deep inside her heart burned memories that could not be silenced. Before she ever put on the plain uniform of service, she had lived a life of rhythm and grace, her name once whispered with admiration in the world of competitive dance. She remembered the bright lights of the stage, the thunderous applause of crowds, and the countless hours of discipline that sculpted her body into a vessel of art. She remembered how her feet used to glide, how music once carried her into a world where she belonged, and how victory after victory had crowned her a rising champion. Life had been cruel, stripping her of that stage and pushing her into obscurity. But the skill, the discipline, and the soul of a dancer had never left her. With steady hands, she set the tray down on a side table, the clinking of glasses silencing a few chuckles in the crowd. Then she took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the ballroom. The sudden hush that fell over the hall was almost electric. Every eye was fixed on her as if waiting for a spectacle of embarrassment. The millionaire's wife leaned towards her friend with a smirk that dripped venom and whispered, "She will trip within seconds." The guests exchanged knowing glances, prepared to laugh again, but the son's expression was different. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the maid, and what he saw made his breath catch. She did not tremble. She did not falter. There was a quiet strength radiating from her, the kind of courage that made him forget the titles, the riches, and the arrogance that filled the room. She was not just a maid. She was something far greater, though most were too blind to see it. The quartet lifted their bows, and as the first notes of the waltz began to flow through the air, the maid closed her eyes for half a heartbeat. Then she moved. Her first turn was simple yet flawless, her posture commanding, her movement fluid like silk unraveling in the air. The room gasped. No longer did they see a servant fumbling for dignity. They saw an artist awakening after years of silence. Her feet glided with memory, her arms curved with elegance, and every spin was a declaration that she had never been broken. The whispers ceased. The laughter died. Even the chandeliers seemed to shimmer brighter as her presence transformed the ballroom into a stage. What was meant to be her humiliation was becoming her triumph, and in that moment, the entire atmosphere shifted, leaving everyone breathless before the revelation that this maid was not just a servant. She was a champion reclaiming her crown. The music rose with a steady rhythm, the violins weaving into the air like threads of gold, and the maid let her body respond to it with an elegance no one in the room could have anticipated. Her first steps were light, almost delicate, but filled with precision that only years of training could produce. Each turn of her body seemed effortless, yet carried with it a weight of discipline and mastery that left the crowd frozen in disbelief. The laughter that had once rolled through the mansion evaporated as silence replaced mockery. Silence so profound that even the sound of her shoes brushing against the marble floor seemed like part of the music itself. She lifted her chin with quiet confidence, her arms unfolding in perfect arcs, every movement flowing into the next like water pouring from a crystal fountain. What they saw before them was not a maid fumbling awkwardly through a challenge. What they witnessed was the return of a champion to her rightful stage. She spun gracefully, her dress catching the light of the chandeliers, casting ripples of color across the polished walls. Guests leaned forward, their eyes wide, jaws slightly parted, unable to reconcile the image of the woman they had dismissed as a servant with the vision of artistry unfolding before them. For every spin, every glide, every lift of her hand, there was a message unspoken yet undeniable. She was more than their cruel assumptions, more than their prejudice, more than the uniform she wore. She carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had fought battles unseen, endured hardship, and refused to let the world strip away her greatness. Each step on the marble floor was a defiance, a refusal to be diminished, and the crowd could feel it pressing against their hearts. The son's eyes never left her. He was captivated, not by her beauty alone, though it shone more radiant than the jewels worn by any guest, but by the fire that seemed to blaze from her soul. In her confidence he saw freedom, in her grace he saw truth, and in her strength he saw a woman who was unshakable even when surrounded by those who wished her to fail. As the dance deepened, he felt an emotion stirring in him that he could not name, but it was powerful, undeniable, and it told him that this woman standing before him was unlike any he had ever met. Across the room, the millionaire's wife grew pale, her lips parting but no words escaping. The smirk she had worn so proudly was gone, melted into disbelief and a creeping dread. She had sought to humiliate, to strip away dignity, yet she had instead unleashed a revelation that would haunt her. For the maid had not just danced. She had claimed the room, conquered their arrogance, and silenced their cruelty with a grace so overwhelming that not a single soul could dare laugh again. When the final turn came and she froze in perfect stillness, the ballroom erupted into thunderous applause, not out of politeness but because they knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. The final note of the waltz faded into the air like the last whisper of a dream, and for a moment the entire ballroom remained frozen in silence. Time seemed to hang between the glittering chandeliers and the polished marble floor, the guests staring in awe at the maid who had just transformed their world with her dance. Then, suddenly, applause erupted, breaking the stillness like a storm. Hands clapped furiously, cheers rang out, and some even rose from their seats in respect, unable to contain the emotion the performance had stirred in them. A few of the women dabbed at their eyes with delicate handkerchiefs, ashamed of the cruel laughter they had so easily joined in before. The same mouths that mocked her now whispered words of admiration, their tones filled with regret. In that instant, the balance of power in the mansion shifted. The one they had sought to ridicule had become the star of the night, and they, the so-called elite, were left humbled in her presence. The millionaire's wife stood stiffly at the center, her face pale with disbelief. She opened her mouth to reclaim control, to twist the moment back into her favor, but her voice trembled and refused to rise above the applause. Before she could recover, her son stepped forward, his shoes striking the marble with quiet certainty. The crowd parted for him instinctively, their applause softening as all eyes turned toward him. He reached the maid, and for a heartbeat, the world held its breath again. Then, in front of everyone, he extended his hand, not mockingly, not as a performance, but with the sincerity of a man who had just witnessed true greatness. His voice carried clearly across the hall, steady and strong. "You have shown them who you truly are. You are no servant to mock. You are a champion." His words echoed through the room, striking harder than any insult ever could, dismantling the cruel arrogance that had lingered there moments before. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and then a wave of whispers spread as recognition dawned on some of the older guests. They remembered her face, not as a maid, but as a young dancer who had once taken stages by storm, winning international competitions with the same fire they had just witnessed. Murmurs of her past rose like embers in the air, and the truth spread swiftly. This was no ordinary woman, no forgotten servant hidden in the corners of wealth. She was a champion who had been brought low by circumstance, yet who had risen again in the unlikeliest of places, shining brighter than the richest jewels in the hall. The millionaire's wife lowered her head, her pride shattered, while the guests who had mocked now found themselves bowing their heads in shame. They applauded again, not out of mere politeness, but because they knew they had been taught a lesson they would not soon forget. And as the maid stood there, tall and proud, the son looked at her not as a servant, but as a woman who had danced, through pain, prejudice, and humiliation, and turned it into triumph. That night, the mansion was not ruled by money or arrogance, but by the undeniable strength of a woman who refused to be broken,